So after our study of communism and the critiques of capitalism that people like Marx, Lenin, and Mao made on capitalist forms of economy and free markets a la Adam Smith, we saw that actually communism didn't catch on as a universal form of political economy, but the critiques against capitalism were taken to heart. And one of the reasons that they were taken to heart is because other philosophers who were avid capitalists, like the famous French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, they themselves gave separate arguments showing that capitalism must produce more poverty than it alleviates. And in an essay that Tocqueville wrote called A Memoir on Pauperism, pauperism is another word for indigence or poverty, he asked the question, does an increase in civilization or prosperity actually create a dependent class in society, much like Marx talked about with the proletariat, a class that cannot go away, cannot be alleviated, and thus what must capitalism do about it? What must capitalistic societies with this tremendous amount of wealth do about this question of poverty? And the way in which Tocqueville puts it is very interesting, because he traveled all around Europe, and when he was writing in the mid-1800s, what he discovered is that the richer the nation, the more people were in need of public support. And so thus he wanted to answer this question: why do the richest nations have the most poor? Where the way he defined poor was those who were in need of external support to meet their daily needs. He noticed, for example, in England, which was the richest nation at the time, that it had the greatest GDP, but it also had 1 in 6 people who were in need of public assistance. Whereas if you went to a more impoverished nation in Europe, like Portugal or Spain, you discovered that, for example, in Portugal, those who needing public assistance were about 1 in 26. And he thought this was strange. Why would a nation that has so much wealth, and that wealth is so widespread, be such that actually its poverty problem seems to be greater? Wouldn't the growth of civilization, the growth of the market economy, the growth and widespread distribution of a middle class actually decrease the number of people who are in need of assistance? Wouldn't it raise in general the standard of living of everybody? And what Tocqueville sets out to do is show in this first lecture, in the first part of his book, why actually the laws of the growth of civilization actually lead to this result, that the richer the nation, the more it will have a poverty problem. He attributes this to 2 causes. But in order to understand these causes, you need to understand the law of growth that he assumes here. I've written it here, and that is, the more power we have, the more our desires increase. Okay? You've heard the old Spider-Man thing, with great power comes great responsibility. But there's a flip side to that. With greater power comes greater vision as to what I can do, and greater thought about the various possibilities for my own life. And thus, with more power comes the visions of more things that I can acquire, more enjoyments that I can enjoy, more comforts that I can rest in. And thus, the more I have, the more I want. The larger the life, the greater the needs, you might say. And it's on this basis that he's going to say 2 basic factors arise that make it impossible that poverty go away in rich nations, but in fact are such that the more the riches increase, the more the poverty problem exacerbates. So how does that work? Well, think of it like this. When you have a nation or a tribe that is on a subsistence level, they're hunting, they're happy if they meet their needs. When I was in the Army, for example, in basic training, the thing that I wanted the most, because I was in basic training during the winter, was warmth. because we would wake up at 3 in the morning and it would be -2 degrees out, and we would go out and we couldn't put our winter coats on because we were going to do an 8-mile march. And when we did that march, we would sweat no matter how cold it was, and so we couldn't put our winter jackets on until we got to where we were going to actually eat breakfast in the training ground. And so during that time, the one thing I would have loved to have was just warmth. I would have been happy for that. And thus, the more you're suffering, the less your desires, the fewer your desires. The desires are all directed toward just meeting your daily needs: food, shelter, warmth, safety. And so you might say that in a society that's barbaric or uncivilized, not a lot of wants, and therefore not hard to meet them. But as civilization grows, the power to produce grows, and when that power to produce grows, life standards increase, and therefore comfort increases, and the demand for comfortable things increases because the power of human thought increases. And so as a result, you're going to have a demand for luxury or non-necessity items precisely because advanced civilizations produce surpluses, and now people want that surplus. They're not going to be satisfied with simply meeting their needs. So, with that, causes an increase in luxury production, which means that you have to then have a third sector of the economy. You might say in the primitive economies that are above the hunting economy, you have farming, and then you have those who protect the farmers, the lords, feudal society, lords and serfs, and that's pretty much it. But then as trade increases, technology increases, the demand for things other than food and shelter increase, then you're going to have a group of people that move off the farm. And when they move off the farm, they're going to be committed to meeting the market need for luxury production. You see, as long as you're a farmer, if there's a decrease in general desire for corn outside of your farm, you can't make a lot of money, but you still have land, don't you? And so you can produce enough so that at least you can survive, even if not in luxury. So a farmer, someone who has land, or even if they don't own the land, they farm the land, then it's going to be much harder for them to be impoverished to the point of not being able to meet their daily needs, precisely because even in the worst of times, they still have food. But now think about this third class that has arisen, who's now moved off the land. And as civilization increases, then urbanization increases, and therefore this class increases, and the farming class decreases the number of farmers, because the technology for farming gets better, and so you need fewer and fewer people farming the land, and you need more and more people who are in this, what he calls an industrial class. But what is this class like now? Well, first of all, it's a class that's completely dependent on what he calls secondary need markets. Secondary needs meaning what? Things that are not essential. So that if there's a famine, if there's a recession, then the first things that go down in demand are these secondary needs, these luxuries. We'll call them luxuries. The things that people would like to buy when they're happy and rich, but won't buy when they're tightening their belt, like right now during the coronavirus epidemic. And so thus what happens is this. You now have a class that cannot support themselves except by the demand of the market. They're an entirely dependent class, one that does not have the skill to produce its own food. And therefore, when the markets go down, when the demand for luxuries go down, then they are completely out of luck, aren't they? Why are they out of luck? Well, because their livelihood is gone. And they don't have a secondary backup of being able to at least grow their own food and therefore survive. And so once the markets go down, they are entirely dependent on that market, and they become completely unable to sustain and support themselves. And so thus, as civilization grows, luxury production grows. And as luxury production grows, the dependent class, the industrial class, grows. And thus, a class that is attached to the vicissitudes of the market. And once those markets go down, unemployment goes up, and they are completely without a means to sustain themselves and their dependence. And thus civilization leads to the growth of this precarious class, a class that at any second can become impoverished and completely impoverished. So not only does that happen because of luxury production, but luxury production occurs naturally because people, as their means grow, their desires grow, as we already said. And as their desires grow, it becomes the new normal for them. So therefore, with the growth of civilization, we know that the standard of living rises. And as the standard of living rises, then what that means is that what were luxuries before now become the new norm. What you should expect in life in the United States and England. When I was growing up back in 12 BC, before cell phone, there were no cell phones and there were no personal computers. There was no ability to do something like this. There was no internet. But we were all fine with that. We didn't know what we were missing. And so it was not even a desire. It was not even a blip on our map. But then what happened? Well, as standard of living increases, technology increases, the availability of these wonderful devices increases, it becomes a habit to have these things now. And therefore a new standard of living evolves, a new normal. And now what was a luxury before now becomes habitual. And what's habitual is now what you expect as just your normal lifestyle in this nation. So now imagine yourself that you can't have a cell phone. Imagine that's taken away from you. Imagine yourself without a car. What are you going to feel? You're going to feel as if your daily needs cannot even be met. And so these luxuries through habituation become new needs, don't they? So as civilization increases, the daily needs increase. But then that means that there is going to be a growth in the population of those who cannot meet their daily needs, precisely because the growth of civilization means the growth of need. So more prosperity doesn't necessarily mean more people are prosperous, does it? In fact, it might mean that it takes more to be not poor. And so he says these two factors, therefore, lead to this correlation between poverty and civilization. As civilization grows, then so does the standard of living grow, and therefore the poverty line goes up. And therefore, as civilization grows, so does the need, so does poverty grow. So our next question is, well then, how does civilization solve this problem? Does this mean that we need to set up a social safety net, a welfare state, you might say? Very relevant for today, isn't it? In our next couple of videos, we will see why Tocqueville thinks that the worst idea is to set up a welfare state.